It's 11:59, and we're going to begin. It is going to be more than just Marshall and Stan.
All right.
It's 11:59. No, now it's 12. And we've already begun. Except that Jenny is not here yet. There she is. Jenny's here.
Hey, guys.
Hi, Jenny.
We have begun. Are you comfortable?
Yeah, I have my beverages.
I do too. I've just got hot water and coconut oil. What do you have?
I have water, coffee, and green tea.
Whoa, you're serious.
It's the Draftsmen Show. Yeah.
Well, Jenny, it's a pleasure to finally meet you.
You too, Stan.
I've been feeling a little left out. Marshall said you guys have been talking a lot the past few weeks.
I keep trying to add you into our conversation, like, hey, but what if this is going to change when Stan's in the conversation?
It might. I'm excited to hear what you guys have been discussing. I'm going to play the role of the ignorant guy who doesn't want to hurt anybody.
Oh, okay, that'll be easy. I should introduce Jenny. Let me introduce Jenny. I met Jenny this past year in class, and I had mentioned LaGuardia High School of the Arts about how much I admired some artists, comic book artists who came out of that high school in the 1930s and 40s. And Jenny introduced herself to me as someone who had gone to LaGuardia High School of the Arts in recent years. So we had an historical connection. And then when I found out that she was a history major, specializing in race and migration. Is that correct, Jenny?
Yes, it is.
My response is I want to talk more with you because Jenny knows a lot about things that Stan and I do not know about. And so conversations began to come up that put me in a position where I felt like whenever I need to ask someone who's an advisor and counsel on things that I'm ignorant about regarding marginalized social groups, things like sexualization of women in comics, things like stereotyping of minorities in storytelling, Jenny has been my go-to person. And I have mentioned this to Stan, and so we are bringing you onto this podcast to talk with us.
So a few weeks ago, we had an episode, I think it was just a voicemail episode, and one of the voicemail questions brought up the topic of over-sexualizing women. And we didn't really have too much to say about it. And we also felt it was unfair that two guys would be talking about it. So we promised the audience that we would bring in a female voice to the conversation. And it ended up being that the female voice was also just a lot more knowledgeable in the whole topic than us. So I'm excited to learn about it. I think it'll be good.
Well, I've enjoyed conversations with Jenny. Jenny knows a lot, and Jenny is also thoughtful in her responses. And I think before we get into any of the content of this, Jenny, our audience doesn't know you except through what I've said. Tell us a bit about you and how you came to be.
How I came to be.
So there was a man and a woman. The whole story, Jenny, the whole thing.
Yeah, we can spend the whole hour on the saga. No, you don't need to do that, Jenny. Tell us what you think is relevant.
What I think is relevant. Okay, so I immigrated to the States when I was 7. My dad came here in 2002, and my mom and I came in 2005 to New York, where I grew up. I grew up with working class parents, and I grew up moving around. I went to 4 different elementary schools, and I was lucky enough to have a good art teacher in middle school that I had a portfolio that got me accepted at LaGuardia. And that really shaped a majority of my experiences because I was going to school with students from all 5 boroughs in the city, and I was getting like 3 periods of art class every single day for 4 years. So that was something that I really, really valued. And then I traveled around a lot and I did a lot of global volunteer work. I went to college at the University of Chicago, and I majored in history with a focus on race and migration, but I also ventured into things like anthropology, like the history of Black Chicago, about Asian American history, and so on and so forth. And here I am now in Los Angeles learning art.
What do you mean by global volunteer work? What did you do?
So when I was 16, I traveled with a nonprofit to Haiti for about 6 weeks to do community teaching, things like that. And then over the next few years, I went to places like the DR, like Peru. I studied abroad in Paris and Senegal, and being able to, like, having the privilege of traveling and seeing the world as an immigrant kid, that was something that I think fundamentally shaped the way that I see things.
Cool. That's a nice resume.
I want to interject something here. Jenny, we've been in a couple classes, and I don't yet know your work because they've been either a seminar or they were at Concept Design Academy, where it was mainly lecture-based. And we're finally in a class where you are going to be presenting artwork. So I guess that finally begins. Yeah, I'm sorry, I did not introduce you as an artist and as a graphic novelist. I introduced you as a student and resident historian.
Yeah, I'm excited to, I think since coming back to LA and working on my skills a lot, like now I'm ready to show you my work.
But you have been a history major and you are now shifting from what you've done in university to putting together a portfolio to become an artist?
Yeah, I have always wanted to be an artist, but I think that this is more about growing up as an Asian kid and feeling like what is expected of me is to go into a profession that is like viable or responsible. And so after LaGuardia, I decided to go into research. I almost started applying for PhDs after graduation from college because I was really passionate about learning those subjects. But I think that deep down, I cared the most still about bringing those stories and bringing the history that I'd learned into visual story formats.
Mm-hmm.
So my parents also moved from New York to LA like 2 years ago, and so it made things really convenient for me.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you're in Southern California. The caller who called us and started this conversation had 2 parts to the question. One was, what do you guys make of the sexualization of women in comics? The other was, do you have a message in your art? And both Stan and I sort of confessed our emptiness of a message in our art. How do you feel about that question? Do you feel like, as a graphic novelist, as a person who's going into the arts, that you have something you want to communicate through it?
Wait, Marshall, can I interject and say the listener didn't ask about comics?
Oh.
Just about figure drawing.
Boom, Marshall.
I stand corrected.
She's already educating you, Marshall.
Yeah. Jenny, do you have a message in your art? Do you have something that drives you to tell stories that has to do with getting a message across?
Yeah. I think that visual storytelling is the best way for me to share my experiences and for readers and viewers to make interpretations and relate to them in their own ways. It's a super empathetic way of exchanging art. And so I'm really passionate about strong queer women of color protagonists. And I'm taking a bunch of classes now so that one day soon I can publish graphic novels that feature strong queer women of color protagonists. and tell stories about them that are magical and fantastical and complex, and not just about their identities, but about anything that they're capable of accomplishing.
So this is what drives you, and you're getting your craft to serve that.
Can you tell us why it's important for that kind of stuff to be out there?
Yeah, for sure. I think that in mainstream pop culture and media, there's a lot of whitewashing that happens, which means that we see a lot of white characters on TV shows and in movies and in comic books, etc. And that's not fully reflective of what this country's population is. So I grew up reading a lot of stories about white characters who were the centers of their stories. And in recent years, I've been finding a lot of recently published graphic novels that are written by Black women, women of color, that feature our own stories in a way that that weren't available to me as a young child. So it's really important for me to not only read those stories, but to write stories that reach kids who are like me. So young immigrant girls who are trying to figure out their identities, but don't have any mainstream media to look at as examples.
Okay, so this comes out of your experience.
I would imagine that doesn't only empower minorities and women, but it also gets the white kids who are not minorities more acceptable to diversity when they see all different types of characters being portrayed as heroes.
Yeah, for sure. I think so my brother is 9 years younger than me, so he's Gen Z, and he's growing up in a completely different world of representation because he has access to all of these different stories. Mm-hmm. So I think that the kind of people that the kids a generation younger than me, they're going to grow up with all of the knowledge that you're talking about, right? Is that they're empathetic and they're knowledgeable about kids and people from all kinds of different cultural experiences in this country and outside of this country.
That is happening. Jenny, one thing that when I mentioned to you at Concept Design Academy, we were having a conversation at break, that I think it's getting better, isn't it? And there was a look on your face of astonishment that would come from a guy who is not that aware of what other people's experiences are outside of his little enclave. Is that what your facial expression was when I said that?
That is. Yes.
Okay, that's why we're having this conversation.
What exact thought went through your head?
I think it wasn't even a thought. It was like an instinct, right? Uh-huh. To keep advocating for the fact that there's a lot of different kinds of marginalized voices that continue to struggle within the art industries. Like when I'm talking about my identities, like being a woman, being an immigrant, being Chinese American, that's only a small fraction of all the different identities that are marginalized. So like when we talk about like what the cultural revolution or the change is happening for or who it's happening for, we also have to acknowledge like it's not happening for a lot of people. Trans folks, queer folks, non-binary folks, women of color, they're all fighting for a space to tell their own stories without having to kind of wash it down for anybody else, right? A space where they can safely share their experiences so that they can reach out to more people like them. And so while I think that there's been a lot of good stuff that's been coming out in the recent years, it is an ongoing process and it has the potential to keep getting better.
Now, I'm hearing two things. One is the content of the stories and the images themselves and the depiction of people. The other is the industry and job opportunities, getting in. Do you see those as two separate things? Do they overlap to you?
Yeah, I definitely think that so stories and images have power. Art is a form of communication. And so when we see the way that people are wrongly depicted or misrepresented, it affects the way that we see them and treat them in real life. Maybe not consciously, maybe subconsciously, but the two things are definitely related. When it comes to the sexualization of women in art and in comics and in media, one, it's important to understand how and why that's being done, and to talk about the fact that this affects how we treat women in real life, right? Women are constantly subjected to gender discrimination, to unwanted advances from men, from people in general, from unequal pay. So it's so important to see those two things as existing in a larger cultural and societal trend or phenomenon.
Okay. This will open up a lot of things as we get talking. Let's start with the imagery issue, the sexualization of women in pictures. And I want to hear what you have to say. I do want to throw something out to what some people have said, that it's just a matter of preference. Actually, it's not just a matter of preference. Preference is that I like clean shaven. I like a beard. It is a matter of politics, because the depiction of people by a mainstream affects how the society perceives people. And even if the person with the power is not aware that they have the power, they still have the power. And it makes a difference. And so the voices that are rising up right now in such volume and unison is to challenge these presumptions. Did what I say, is what I said accurate to set the tone for this?
Yeah, I think that was really comprehensive.
Now, we want to hear this from you about how you have perceived treatment of women and people of color, is the term that you use, minorities and marginalized people in culturally accepted art.
Culturally accepted is a really good term to use. I think, for instance, when we're talking about American comics, women in American comics, as a child, I was always struggling with kind of liking American comics because I couldn't really relate to the women that were in there. It doesn't mean that their sexualization is inherent, like just problematic. It just means that it wasn't relating to how I perceive myself or other women in my life.
Okay, for example, Frank Frazetta's work. When you first saw it, and as you have seen it, how did you respond to it? His name comes up a lot because he was probably the most influential sci-fi fantasy illustrator of the late 20th century. He continues to be influential, and because he painted women a lot. He painted subjects that come right to this. I'd like to know what your response was when you saw his work and as you continued to look at it.
I think my first response was based on my instinct as an art student, which is just, wow, the composition is gorgeous. Right? And then I look closer and I see vaguely Asian looking women who are semi-naked, and it seems interesting to me because it is so, his paintings are so subject to his own male gaze. So all of the paintings that I've looked at that he's done frames a man's perspective of what a woman's body should look like. And I think that his own interpretation is valid, but that's not the only way to depict nude or sexualized women.
Okay. Now, of course, somebody would say, of course, it's not the only way, but it's the way Frazetta does it. And why is there criticism of it? You use the term the male gaze. I want to hear more about that, how you define it. I mean, it seems like it's self-defined, but I have heard it used a lot, and I would love to get a definition from you. to the 11-year-old me of what it would mean?
Yeah, I think a really simple way of thinking about the male gaze is just any film or illustration or piece of art that frames the composition and the perspective in the perspective of a man. So why that's important to acknowledge is that then in the perspective of a man, women subjects in artwork are usually depicted only for male desire. So I think when we're talking about, let's say, the representation of women in comics, oftentimes because it's male artists and male writers, the superheroines oftentimes are defenseless or they're unnecessarily sexualized. And they appeal for a wider male audience, but they don't appeal for a lot of everyone else.
Can I bring up some examples that I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on?
Yeah.
I know that a lot of our audience might be thinking, maybe a lot of the men might be thinking, like, first of all, what's wrong with the male gaze? Like, is there anything wrong with it, or is just the fact that that's the only thing that's in the mainstream? And also, is there anything wrong in a similar way to the female gaze? For example, there's Twilight. That's definitely from a female point of view, sexualizing a vampire guy who's this perfect man. And then there's 50 Shades of Grey, right? So I really want to know your thoughts on those.
I do too. I am interested in this. And Jenny, Stan brought up the thing: is there anything wrong with it? That's the first thing that a morally sensitive person would ask. Is that have I been doing something wrong? Is there something that?
Yeah.
And so help straighten me out here for the ethics of this as well as the context of it. We're trying to broaden this context to understand it better.
I think that with the male gaze, it's a broader question of how much of the media we consume is dominated by the male gaze, right? I very, very rarely see films or TV shows that are solely under or directed under the female gaze. And I think most recently, a movie that I really loved, it was directed by queer women, and it's called A Portrait of a Lady on Fire. And the story involves almost entirely women at its center. So I think that's a really good example of the female gaze. But the fact that there's not a lot of movies like that in the mainstream media, it kind of shows that there still needs to be more representation for media that portrays stories with the female gaze. I think with the male gaze, I think objectively it's not bad, but I think that it's important even still to create female characters that are fully fledged, complicated, complex human beings who have more to their character in terms of like character writing and development than just their relationships to men.
Right.
Okay, you're prompting questions for me. How are you doing, Stan? Do you have questions that you want to jump in with first, or?
I still want to know her thoughts on Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey.
My friend and
Do you
I,
like that?
Yeah, I just rewatched Twilight like 2 weeks ago.
Have you been reading the new one from Edward's point of view, the book?
Midnight Sun. No, I have not, and I'm so excited to.
My wife's been reading that every night.
Fantasizing about that perfect vampire.
But I'm just as pale as Edward, so, she got her vampire.
I was actually just reading about vampirism as a novel genre and how so many queer people relate to it, because it's about shame and about kind of being hidden, and making that connection was really, really eye-opening and interesting.
That is.
Yeah, right? On the topic of like Twilight, I've never thought about Twilight as a movie done with the female gaze. I think part of that has to do with the fact that I am queer, and I think like seeing sexualized men in media doesn't appeal to me as much as it would for straight women. So I think that's coming from a really personal perspective. And also I think like Twilight, I love Twilight, but it is not the most well-produced movie in the world.
Right, yeah, the movies. Well, can I say how I think maybe it could be slightly towards the female gaze?
Go for it.
I think that the way Edward is, his character is what women want all men to be like.
Yeah.
And it's not what men are like. You know, it's like he doesn't want to have sex with her because he doesn't want to hurt her. He doesn't have that drive. Everything that he does is to protect her. Right? It's, you are my life and everything I do is for you. Which there's nothing wrong with that. I think men should strive to be more like that. But it's definitely written from kind of like the point of view of what a woman wishes their man would be like. Which I don't think I don't see anything really wrong with that. I mean, I watched the movies with my wife and I was like, cool, fun. I wasn't offended at all.
I haven't seen the movies, and it's unfortunate because when students told me when the first movie came out, and I said, what's it about? And somebody explained that it was about a woman in love with a vampire who's in love with her, but they aren't going to get together because he'll turn her into a vampire. I said, what a great premise. That sounds, I'm eager to see this movie. And several students said, no, you aren't. Don't go see that movie. You will not like it. Yeah. So I was sorry that I had to miss out on it, not because the idea wasn't a good idea, but because the production wouldn't have satisfied somebody curmudgeonly.
The reason I'm asking this isn't because it's because I'm curious if the way I'm thinking is, I'm probably missing something.
Yes.
Right? And you probably see what I'm missing. Can you tell me what I'm not thinking about?
Yeah, I think when you bring these points up about Edward, the first thing that comes into mind in terms of the story is when in New Moon, he suddenly leaves Bella because he thinks that he needs to do what he thinks is right for her. So this suddenly abruptly breaks their relationship and ends with Bella not knowing what anything is happening is for. So Edward very badly miscommunicates or doesn't communicate his desires and wishes to protect her. So he actually doesn't center or prioritize what she actually wants. It's more about what he thinks she wants.
That's an interesting distinction.
Okay.
That's fascinating. That in a relationship, those are things that go wrong. I think I'm doing the best thing from my point of view, as opposed to the other person who is so affected by it.
You brought up 50 Shades of Grey, too. I think for both of these examples, though, it's also hard for me to speak about the male gaze in these movies, the female gaze in these movies, because it's a white female gaze.
No, tell us, help us clarify here, because now we're starting to get very specific. That somebody mentioned bringing a woman onto the Draftsmen podcast to talk about these things is pretty pointless. I think because there's no such thing as a hive mind for women. We know that. We're trying to broaden the conversation, and now we're broadening the conversation, but we find that it can be broadened and looked at in a number of ways. That's why I would love to hear you elaborate on the difference between white female gaze, and any other kind of female gaze from your point of view.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Every woman, based on all the identities that she has different experiences and different perceptions about films and art and things like that. For me, I think with movies like Twilight and 50 Shades, the majority of the characters in the films, certainly the protagonists, are all white. And I can watch it with my friends and laugh and enjoy it, but at the end of the day, when I don't see people who look like me or other Black people and people of color, it doesn't allow me to enter the story in the same way that people who are represented by the film do.
Now that you've said that, I am starting to see a whole bunch of other things that could be our topics, and I don't know whether we want to delve into this, but let me just throw out what's on my mind. When you talk about representation of women in stories, or representation of minorities in stories, there is the lack of representation. And then there's another thing that can go awry, which is that there's representation and it's done in a way that does more harm than good. This came up in a podcast that we did just a few weeks ago about what you do with the stereotypes that are in the art or the instruction or in mainstream media. What do you do with those? And how do you know to judge them? And how do you know when creating a character to avoid harmful depictions?
I think we can take it one part at a time.
Okay.
So you mentioned the misrepresentation and the lack of representation of marginalized groups and peoples. How to study art that represents or misrepresents those people, and how people in the contemporary world can write and draw them. So let's begin with art that we study as art students, because I think that might be a really helpful way to begin the conversation. I think that a lot of Western canon art history shows masterful paintings that, for the most part, only portray white figures and white bodies. And when they portray other people, it's usually wrongly represented.
When you say wrongly represented, that word needs to be unpacked, right?
Yeah.
Represented in ways that do more harm than good, in ways that have not been scrutinized and are now being scrutinized very much. The specifics of how wrongly represented are something I would like to look at. I want to know about those things and understand how to respond to them.
Some great examples to start with would be Jean-Léon Gérôme, would be Eugène Delacroix. They're both French painters from the 1800s who are considered a part of the Orientalism movement in art history. So some of their paintings are really well known for their portrayal of the Middle East, of Islamic cultures, but they're harmful because they are based on these French painters' kind of stereotyped understandings of what these cultures are like.
Okay.
We can talk about Orientalism, which means, kind of in modern day terms, the racial or sexual stereotyping of quote unquote faraway cultures from Asia, from the Middle East, from what we consider the East as a distinction from the West. And so, yeah, a lot of these paintings romanticize and exoticize these peoples that are different from who have different identities and cultures from these painters.
Okay, here's what I'm hearing. That we've got European painters. They got tremendous craft. They're going to show you pictures of other people. People way over there, an exotic, faraway culture, mysterious and fascinating, dangerous. Watch how we depict them. And in doing so, they have essentially taken another culture as grist for the mill, as fodder for the machinery of what kind of yarn I'm going to weave, which in some little isolated context may not make any difference, but in a global context where there's interaction between these cultures, or when there can be war between these cultures, that could be a really dangerous thing. Is that what's happening? Is that because it is a depiction of other through very limited lenses, that it is what is now called cultural appropriation?
cultural appropriation is a more helpful term to think about contemporary arts.
Okay.
I think for Orientalist painters, they exoticized the people and the objects and the cultural architecture of exotic people, which means that they turned something ordinary, what is ordinary for other people, everyday life for other people, into kind of objects of fascination. They turned people in these paintings into objects of fascination. They are fascinating and exotic because they're different from these white French painters. And historically, this is coming from a context where in the mid to late 19th century, France and England were conquering, colonizing, and imperializing different parts of the world, basically throughout the world. So they were taking over these cultures and these societies at the same time that they're painting romanticized images of them.
Wow, that is a fascinating contradiction. That politically, there's a brutality going on. There's something that is oppressive, unfair, and then artistically, there is this, oh, isn't it all so sweet?
Aren't those different people doing it? Like it's the politician and then there's the artist who maybe appreciates the culture, maybe not. I'm just throwing out an idea. Like, what's the difference here between finding something you don't know, which happens to be someone else's culture, and thinking, whoa, that's cool. I appreciate that. I'm going to depict it in my art because I think it's cool. What's the difference between appreciating it and exoticizing it? What did you say?
Exoticizing was one word you used. I used the word cultural appropriation. I am interested in how what they were doing in the 19th century would be different from cultural appropriation now. And was there another word you used, Jenny?
Exoticizing, othering.
Othering.
Orientalizing.
Are they all different? These words, they all mean something different.
They have the same umbrella of meanings, but they have like different distinctions.
Okay. So can you tell me the difference between just appreciating something and appropriating it?
Yeah, appropriating it. That's a big dichotomy of what is the difference between how would a French artist who happened to be interested in other cultures at that time, how would they have done differently? That becomes relevant to what's going on now.
For French painters at that time, for example, if you look at Eugene Delacroix, he's famous for painting the Lady of Liberty for the French Revolution from the 1830s, I think. And when you compare that painting of him representing his own people in their pursuit for self-empowerment and self-determination, in contrast to the way he portrayed Algerian women in his painting The Women of Algiers and other paintings like that, it has a different message for it. Is, for example, with his French Revolution painting, it's we are empowered, we are striving for advancement and freedom, whereas for his Orientalist paintings, it's about how he perceives these people, but he's also, in a way, speaking over their own experiences. He wouldn't have asked them like, hey, how would you want to be portrayed? So I think in terms of cultural appreciation versus appropriation, with appreciation, you have to do the research and also just reach out to the people you're representing and be like, hey, is it okay to represent you in this way? And if they say no, you have to take it and understand, or try to understand where they're coming from.
That makes sense.
So what he did wrong is he didn't consider their point of view on what he's making about them.
And also, I'm not as familiar about the art history, but I think my general understanding of artists from this time period is that they're commissioned by wealthier people, and they're not separated from the politics and the society that they're spending their lives in.
Right.
So when their country is colonizing these faraway places, then that kind of political resonance also appears in their imagination and their fantasies.
the question comes up. That was 150 years ago. And so now we have these relics of that era. And how does the fact that the politics have changed relate to this?
Well, it's not just a separation of time, but it's in terms of the contemporary forms of cultural appropriation. We can just talk about the things that happen in this country that we all live in particular.
One example that comes to mind when I think of someone that did it right, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, but the way they did Moana, they did a bunch of research on island culture. I think they traveled for several years to different islands, learning about the culture. And then when they were actually writing the stories and designing the characters, doing the storyboards, they would go back and show the native people there, hey, what do you think of this? And then they would correct them and say, no, that's not what we do. And then they would change it. And so they would actually work with the culture they're representing to try to represent them accurately. Is that how it should be done?
I think that's one way of doing it now that is definitely better. It's definitely an improvement from the way that, for example, like Disney movies have been done in the past.
Right. Is there still something wrong with Moana, the way Moana did it?
I wouldn't say there's anything wrong. I think, for one, as a Chinese American woman, I can only speak for my own identity, so I can't speak for Pacific Islander people and how they might feel about the film because it relates directly to them, right? So that's a part of it. And I also think that when we take stories from other people and make profit off of that, it's a question too of, are we fairly compensating these people with money?
Interesting. Yeah, that's a different. Well, that seems like it's a kind of a different point now, because it's supporting the other culture financially instead of just representing them in some way. So now we're going beyond artistic representation, right? But that's a very fair point.
Yes, and I noticed that when you asked, but that's the right way to do it, Stan.
Yeah.
Jenny hesitated.
She did. That's what I'm curious about. Like, why did you hesitate?
Because it's not her people to speak for.
Right, but I mean, you as someone who studies this kind of thing and you give this a lot of thought, I'm sure you have an opinion about how Pacific Islander people might think about it, right? And as let's say that you worked for Disney and you were on this project, would there be something that you would do differently to make sure that you're approaching this in the right way, other than financial support?
I can think of one. You're asking Jenny, though. I
don't care about you, Marshall.
Yeah.
You're a white old man here.
But that's it. It was two white guys who did it. And it seems like the next thing is to bring in people who are in positions of power on this project. Now, I'm sorry, I jumped in with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, forgive me.
I think Marshall's point is right.
So bringing in Pacific Islander people into power on the project?
Kind of. It's like bring in this country is full of immigrants from different places, and it's a very diverse country, and also because companies can bring in like international artists and train them that way. So it's a way of like making these resources accessible to the people that they're portraying in the movies. But also, I think, like Marshall's point is completely right. It matters to have the people who are being represented in higher positions of power during and throughout the production pipeline. So not just like VizDev artists and designers, but also people who have bureaucratic responsibilities to seeing and production responsibilities to seeing the story through, right? When it comes, when I didn't even know that Moana was written or produced or directed by two white men, but it does change a little bit of how I perceive the story. Is that it's still not 100% what the publishing and literary industry calls own voices.
Interesting. So what I'm hearing though is that it's like, if I'm a white man, I can't do anything. I can't touch anything other than my own culture. Because if I do, then they're going to say, oh no, you should have gotten someone from that culture to do what you just did. Am I hearing that correctly?
When you're asking yourself, like, as a white man, can I even do things like that? You can also ask yourself, am I being a good ally to these people while I'm writing stories about them?
Well, that's why I brought up Moana, is because they went for several years to go and actually work with them. And so it's like, is there something beyond that they should have done?
Yeah.
That's why I brought up Moana, is because, like, to me, it's like they went beyond what I think that almost anyone does.
They did a good job, but the job isn't done.
Yeah. So what else? Like, what do we do even more than that?
Hey, Marshall here with another sponsored Great Courses Plus pitch, for which I have no shame because I pitched these courses long before they ever sponsored us. In our first season of Draftsmen, I brought up Thomas Shippey 3 times just out of sheer enthusiasm for his Heroes and Legends of Literature course. I think these lectures are great, but this has got to be a short commercial. And if I get started, just the first lecture of Frodo Baggins as the surprise hero of the 20th century and Harry Potter as the surprise hero of the 21st century. If you're a storyteller, you can use those insights. Every lecture in here was worth multiple listenings to me. Now for the deal. You, as a Draftsman listener, get access not only to this course, but to the entire library for free for an entire month by using our special URL, thegreatcoursesplus.com/draftsman. This is a limited time offer. Go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/draftsman and check out this course. The content is excellent. And I love listening to Thomas Shippey, and we can have these lectures in common. I recommend them out of sheer interest, but also as a source of discussion among storytellers. thegreatcoursesplus.com/draftsman.
We all go through difficult periods in our lives. Whatever you're struggling with, today's sponsor, BetterHelp, may be able to help you. BetterHelp is giving individuals and couples more choices when it comes to getting professional counseling. Here are some unique benefits to trying BetterHelp. They take the inconvenience out of traveling to an office because everything is handled online. You can schedule appointments at your own time and in the comfort of your own home. And sessions are conducted by secure video or over the phone. Plus, you can chat or text with a therapist. With over 3,000 US licensed therapists to choose from, you can find someone who'll be able to help you out with depression, stress, anxiety, relationships, sleep disorders, trauma, anger, family conflicts, LGBT matters, grief, and self-esteem. And whatever you share is kept completely confidential between you and your therapist. Right now, BetterHelp is offering all Draftsman listeners 10% off your first month with discount code DRAFTSMAN. To get started, go to betterhelp.com/draftsman. Simply fill out a questionnaire to help them assess your needs and get matched with a counselor you'll love. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/draftsman.
Jenny, you have a list, don't you, about what a good ally is?
It's right here.
All right.
Yeah, and something that Marshall said that definitely resonates is like being a good ally and making sure that you're really interrogating yourself about the boundaries between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation. It's a constant process of learning about, like, maybe like a year from now, you'll think back on the work that you did and be like, no, it was not, I can do a better job today. So it's an ongoing learning process. And I have some great questions from Kay Tempest Bradford and Nisi Shawl from Writing the Other, who ask, for allies writing people of color or anyone outside of your own identities, does this mean that white artists and writers should not write about people of color? And other questions. Why do you think you're the best person to write this story? Why are you writing this story? Who will benefit if you write this story? Who is your intended audience? Should you be writing this story? And they also make a really important point about giving the mic to women, to queer artists, to Black, Indigenous, and people of color artists, and they should represent themselves as they see fit, especially if historically artists of these identities have not been given spaces or spotlights to share their work.
That is a great list of questions, too. Those are thought through for soul searching and desiring to do this responsibly. And of course, it is to the mainstream. It is to white artists, white storytellers. Can you tell us the resource for that again?
It's a talk that Kay Tempest Bradford and Nisi Shaw, two Black writers from, I think, a variety of different fiction, but they had a talk called Are You My Ally? And they released it in June, and I watched it pretty recently, and it's a wonderful 2-hour recording talking about how you can be an ally for Black writers, for writers of color, and creatives in general, not just for white allies, but also non-Black allies.
Thank you for that. That's valuable to know about.
That gives me a lot to think about. A lot of thoughts come to mind, but I know that it's like things I need to think about before I say them. So I'm hesitating because it's pretty heavy.
Yeah.
For example, like one of the questions was, are you the best person to write this? Right? Was that one of them? Mm-hmm. Yeah. My follow-up question to that would be like, who is ever the best person to write anything, though? And most artists have
imposter syndrome.
Most artists have imposter syndrome. So if they ask themselves that question, they're always gonna be like, "No, I'm not the best one." It's always gonna be a no, and then we're never going to do anything.
Yeah, but focusing down on that question for whether it's specifically, am I really the best? No, there might be another person who's just been born, and we got to wait till they grow up and they can do it.
Well, the reason I'm bringing that up though is because it is important for someone who isn't in the culture to be able to ask themselves that, because the answer is always going to be no. For someone who isn't from that culture, it's always going to be, no, I'm not the best person to write it. There's no way I'm possibly the best person. But they might be in a position to say something about it. Like, my wife is Filipino. I'm an artist. If I have something to say about my experience with the Filipino culture as an artist, is it okay for me to do that, to say it in my art? Or because I'm not the best person to represent the Filipino culture, I shouldn't even touch it?
Yeah, I'm interested in that too, Jenny. What are your thoughts on that? When somebody is connected to another culture.
Yeah, it's like, I'm definitely not the best person to write it, but like, my son is half Filipino. My wife is full Filipino. Like, I have, it's part of my life. And as an artist, I like to express myself, but I don't want to offend anybody. I want to do the right thing here. And so I'm really actually curious, like, how do I approach this?
Wow, there are so many things. Okay. I think on a more personal, like less societal, whatever, like term, for as far as I know, for mixed race folks and mixed race kids, it's really, it can be really important to distinguish that they're not half of anything.
Okay.
They're Filipino and they're...
Right. They're full Filipino, full Ukrainian.
They're not half of something just because they're mixed race.
That's a good one. I'll stop saying that.
Okay.
They're never full anything. They're always half a person. Huh. Okay, keep going. What else?
What I can say is that you can interrogate what it means for you to be the father of a mixed race Filipino son. Right? That's your positionality, and your perspective is to be the father of your kid. It is not necessarily, when you're thinking about speaking out and standing up for, let's say, against people who discriminate against Filipino folks, it's kind of like, are there better people to take my place to speak out? And how can I DM people or reach out to them privately to ask what they need from me without taking the spotlight from the movement or the efforts that they're making? Because I think other minority cultures and marginalized people can also be capable and complicit in appropriating other cultures. There's rampant anti-Blackness in every non-Black community. There's a lot of appropriation from Black culture in every single non-Black community. And that's not appropriate just because, for example, I identify as a woman of color.
Okay, what you're saying is, yes, that's not your story to tell.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, you spent time in Chicago working with Black communities and children as a docent, didn't you?
Yeah.
I'd like to hear about that.
In my third year of college, I got a docent position at the Smart Museum of Art, which is a campus art museum at UChicago. And I was trained by a wonderful staff of docents. And I learned so much about how to teach kids and other visitors, and not just teach kids about artwork in the museum, but more importantly, to hold space for them to share their understanding and their interpretations of the artwork that we were looking at. So a lot of the time as a docent, I was learning to get really good at prioritizing these students' perspectives on the art, like on top of what the inherent meanings of the art might be, on top of what Western art history canon might say about this artwork. More importantly for the students, their education was forefront in the gallery space.
How do you mean?
Like, I would ask them questions like, what stories do you see in this? What can you tell me about what you understand from this painting? What materials do you think it's made out of? And it was never about me putting a narrative that I had memorized on top of what they were saying.
Okay.
And sorry to interrupt, a docent is like a tour guide at a museum? Am I right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Chicago has a rich culture and history of Black art, and I felt really privileged to be in the presence of paintings by artists like Carrie James Marshall and Kehinde Wiley, and to lead groups of students who are Black and brown and immigrant, and just do something as simple as walk in front of the painting and let them have a conversation about it, right? It wasn't really me doing the work. It was me having the privilege to sit in on the conversations that these students were having and how they related to the paintings because of where they came from and their own experiences. And
you did that for 2 years, is that correct?
Yeah, I did that for 2 years. And I also, through the museum, I also worked as an assistant teaching artist at 2 different Chicago elementary schools.
How did it affect you? I'm asking because I want to see if this changed you and that you grew in your experience in it, if there's anything that I can get vicariously out of this.
I think what I got the most out of in these experiences is that I was being taught and being mentored by Black docents, Black Chicagoan docents, and working with Black teaching artists. And it was so important for me to understand the city that I lived in for 4 years, but it also empowered me to find the courage to write my own stories about my experiences. I was inspired by all of the Black art around me. I was inspired by these students that I was co-teaching who were making collages and making abstract art and getting the space to tell their own stories. And on one hand, it was about how committed I was to making art education accessible for more students. On the other hand, it was really seeing students so much younger than me take charge of their own stories and realizing that I could do that with my own art as well.
So it inspired you to do your own, to use your own voice.
Yeah.
Cultural appropriation happens subconsciously. People don't even know they're doing it. When Isle of Dogs came out, I have not yet seen Isle of Dogs. It's the only Wes Anderson movie I haven't yet seen. And gosh, there was a flurry in my classroom. Students knew right away what the criticism was of it. And I don't know, I cannot critique it because I haven't seen it, but I have understood that that is an example of cultural appropriation. And apparently Wes Anderson was not even aware that he was violating anything. You've mentioned another example. You had another example that is a mainstream film example of cultural appropriation?
Ghost in the Shell, the movie starring Scarlett Johansson, was a big deal.
Oh man, yeah, some are pretty obvious to everybody.
Yeah.
Now, again, I have not seen that movie, and so can you give me if
you don't need to see it. Watch the trailer, you'll know.
I haven't seen the trailer. I don't even know what it's about, except that Scarlett Johansson plays an Asian woman. Is that correct?
Yeah, Scarlett Johansson does that. Scarlett Johansson plays an Asian woman, a Japanese woman, a cyborg who is a Japanese woman, because the original story was, I think, a Japanese anime, like a really, really well-known one. And the whole Asian American community erupted and was like, this is just inappropriate. Like, there's no nuance to it. This is just whitewashing at its finest.
Yeah, I'm surprised no one along the way of making this movie, like, I mean, maybe, I'm sure a lot of people did say something, but the people in charge are probably like, no, it's okay.
The simple solution is to have had a Japanese woman play that role. Is that correct?
Japanese American. There's a huge Asian American population in the United States, many of whom are actresses.
Yeah.
Right. And so here's what's going to happen. Here's what's going to happen with the money investors so that we understand how the dynamics work. We need a name.
No.
Because we're putting all this money into this, and people go to see a movie because it's got a movie star in it that a lot of people do. They've got a movie star in it, they recognize the name, and therefore we cannot risk this investment, which means that the decision becomes political. It has to do with keeping control of the money, that we're going to get back an investment, and this is our best speculation, that if we dare to put someone in the main role who the audience didn't already know, we might lose our money. That's my speculation as to what went on behind the scene. Now, I'm seeing you say, shake your head no.
Well, because the people in charge who are thinking about the financials, if they really made this decision to make more money, they're idiots, because it's pretty obvious that they would make less money this way because your fans are mostly Asian.
Is that the case?
I would assume so.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of Europeans and you know, and white Americans that are fans of manga and anime, but I mean, I would say that more than 50% are Asian. And so it's like, if you do this, you're just offending the majority of the people that are fans of this story.
Yeah.
So it's stupid. Why would you do that?
But they made a bad call, and they know that they made a bad call now in retrospect.
But it's an obviously bad call. No, it's not even retrospect. It was so obvious.
If you want to see some obvious bad calls, go to film history. And you will find movies like Breakfast at Tiffany's that has the worst. I just knew that it was a classic film, and so I'm watching a lot of classic films, and I was so shocked. I was bowled over at what was in that movie, and they on the commentaries it came up. They knew they'd made a mistake right after they made the movie, but it was too late. And so, yeah, there's been a lot of bad calls. Part of why we are having this conversation, Jenny, is to do better, to think these things through in a way where it's going to be better for everybody. The audience, the makers, there can be more cooperation and thought to this. Now, if Isle of Dogs and Ghost in the Shell are examples of how not to do it, can you give us, if those are the goofuses, can you give us the gallant to use a cultural? For those of you who don't know, there was a magazine called Highlights that had a bad kid and a good kid. The bad kid was Goofus. The good kid was Gallant. And they have their own history. That's not what this is about. What this is about is that sometimes the best way to learn is to see, here's someone who does it wrong. Here's someone who does it well. Let's be more like the person who does it well. Can you give us any examples of that?
Yeah, I have some good, like what I think are good examples, and also some in between ones that are good and also can do better.
Let's hear.
I think for the in between examples, one of my favorite animated movies was Big Hero 6, and I love the film so much, but I learned pretty recently that in the production pipeline earlier during VizDev, that Honey Lemon was a brown Latina, and that she got whitewashed until like at the end of the movie production process.
And whitewashed means that her ethnicity has been taken away from her. It's been changed so that it fits into somebody else's idea of who she should be.
Yeah, something like that. It's I think for a lot of POC communities, colorism is a huge deal, right?
Tell us.
Being lighter skinned or darker skinned have big social and societal like implications and effects. So it's really important to not just see a character who is Latina. In this case, we kind of barely acknowledge that in the film too, but a character who is not a white or white passing Latina character.
Wow. Again, this goes back to film history. Rita Hayworth was Latina, and she had to be perceived as white. And then when she played, I think she may have played a Mexican woman, but she had to be perceived as a white woman playing a Mexican woman, even though she was Latina in the first place. So you get into this complex perception labyrinth of craziness like that. And so Big Hero 6 is an example of something that you liked a lot, but it's tainted by the fact that it had to be altered by someone who made the decision, someone who had the power behind the movie to do it this way as opposed to the other way. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I think tainted might be a little too strongly worded. I think for me, it was so important to see two Asian American siblings, because that's me and my brother. Like, I watched the film, and that was the first time like that I didn't just see someone who looked like me, but I saw that character in relationships with other characters that they loved. So good. So yeah. But like definitely knowing that like Honey Lemon's character, like what happened with Honey Lemon's character, that does just dampen the overall joy that watching that film has brought me so many times.
Yeah, let's hear other examples.
The in-betweens, more in-betweens. I love The Princess and the Frog, but it is worth noting that the two main characters spent the majority of the movie as frogs instead of people. That's something to think about. Just something to bring up.
Okay. Yeah.
And Mulan, which is so historically inaccurate and so questionable in its portrayal of the Huns, but it's just the best movie, hands down, like ever, like in existence. But it's not perfect. It's still flawed. It was a product of its time, and we can do better.
Well, why do you say it's the best movie?
Because it's like a strong Chinese warrior who goes against a very, very patriarchal society and becomes a soldier for her family who she loves. And I think like growing up not just as like Asian American, but as first generation Chinese American, I still have a lot of traditional things in my culture embedded in how I see the world. So I also grew up in a very deeply patriarchal society where women don't get as much, like they just don't have as much power. And that's not generalizing for all of society. That's just based on my personal experience. And so to see a character like Mulan doing everything that she does in the film and also being shunned for being a woman and then being redeemed, that was just it was so transformative to see that as a kid
Huh.
and to see it even now.
Lauren Panepinto, in that article on Muddy Colors, talked about cultural exchange, which happens between cultures where there's not a power imbalance. And then cultural assimilation, where people, which is what happened in the United States through the 20th century, is that you came from other cultures, but you would not call yourself by that culture of origin. You called yourself an American. That was a big part of the 20th century. And then there's cultural appropriation and there's cultural appreciation. And the thing that we look for, the two good things there are cultural exchange and cultural assimilation. No, not cultural assimilation. Cultural exchange and cultural appreciation. Sorry, I'm a product of the 20th century. She said, if I recall correctly, I wrote something down in response to it. Appropriation occurs when the appropriator is not aware of the deep significance of the culture that they're partaking in.
I was going to bring up really quickly back to Stan's question about, like, should I be writing this? A conversation that's come up on Twitter recently within, like, POC, writer, artist Twitter is, I think someone made a really good point about how it's important, yes, to do the research and to include different kinds of characters in a story. But if you're, for instance, in this example, it was a white queer author writing about queer people of color characters as your protagonists, it just doesn't reach in the same way. It doesn't mean you can't include them at all, but it is worth questioning having those characters as your protagonists because you can never fully portray them the way that queer people of color can.
That kind of brings us back to the original question of over-sexualizing women. And my main question here is still individual artists who like to draw or paint overly sexualized women. They just enjoy that image. Is anyone really okay to judge that? I mean, I guess we can all judge. It's not illegal to judge, but should we just accept that every artist could just draw whatever they want? And I know I don't want to include like big companies here that are on like cable TV, blockbuster movies, like that's different. If we just focus on individual artists who just want to draw and paint whatever they want to draw and paint, like Kim Jong-gi. And there's several Patreon artists who draw very sexualized women manga characters, and they make millions of dollars at this point. Like, do you think it's okay?
Oh man, I had this conversation with Marshall on the phone just yesterday, and I am so in awe of Kim Jong-gi's work, and it's very difficult for me to see an Asian man drawing often just can be violent or just like really like hypersexualized women in his perspective because of the culture that I grew up in. So it's too close for me to be able to enter and be like, that's okay for me to look at. So I just try to avoid that altogether.
Right. So that's fine too. So nobody has to look at anybody else's artwork, right? Like you have the freedom to look at whatever you want to look at. Should we try to stop people like Kim Jong-gi from drawing what they want to draw?
I think anyone should feel free to draw whatever they want and also still be aware of the effect that their images have when they reach the mainstream. Like, you can be aware of it and still draw the things that you love. Like, it's not anyone else's job or position to tell an artist what they should draw, because the whole point of being an artist is that we get to be agents of our own stories and own imagination and creativity. Mm-hmm. And you can also be aware of, as viewers and as artists, of what that kind of imagery might perpetuate.
Okay. Now this brings up something else, that when we were asked that question, if I had given an answer that I had to boil down, what is the issue? I would have said, I think the most important thing is attitude. Is that there is something about our work that comes out of a spirit. It comes out of a desire, some vibe emotionally, just our bearing. And that if our bearing is positive, seeking the goodwill of others, that's got to make the biggest difference. But that is not necessarily the case, is it, Jenny? I mean, have you seen the pitfalls of what happens when somebody has a good attitude, but they still misfire? I had a great attitude. I intended to hit that target. Oh, I'm sorry. I shot you and you and you. But gosh, my attitude was so good. Do you see examples of that where people who are benign in their intentions do more harm than good?
I think you're bringing up the point of intention versus impact.
Okay.
You can have good intention and still harmful impact. So when, for example, if you do have harmful impact, then it's important to apologize and understand why you did something wrong when you get feedback from the people that or the communities that you've harmed. That's a big part of it. I can't think of any examples that come to mind, though, that where people had good intentions.
I think, to be fair to Kim Jong-gi, though, I think he does. He is considering other people's feelings now. He filters himself way more than he used to, and he always says that, you know, he doesn't try to hurt anyone, but he's happy that he's got people around him that are filtering him. He's got this childlike energy where he can't get out of just focusing on his thoughts and expressing them. It's like he just has to get it out. He's not a politician. He's not trying to make any cultural changes. He's just a dude just drawing at home, and he just happened to get really famous. And I do see him trying more. Even when we were recording the Q&A, there were parts he re-recorded because his crew was like, no, do that again. And then we re-recorded the answers. So that was interesting.
That's a natural evolution that happens that when we are beginning with anything, we're given a lot of license to do things wrong.
Yeah. And
then as we become more and more socialized, we learn that some of these things are not the things I should do. So yeah, that's a movement in a direction. There was another thing. It was about Frazetta.
Oh.
Frazetta's art has been so seen and so influential. And I know that I have students who would think of the idea of it being in any way harmful would be absurd to them. And I know that I have students who can say, yeah, it is harmful. It perpetuates a view of women that is difficult. And when we talked about, should you not be allowed to? Should there be any rule? You know, Frank painted women that were mainly his wife. I mean, he used Ellie as his sort of ideal woman all the way through there. I've wondered what she thought about it and how her opinion weighs into this.
Well, maybe she liked being portrayed that way.
It may be, yes. There's why you don't make the rule.
Yeah, because I know that, most women probably would agree with Jenny, but there's women that are probably on the side of the guys who are, sexualizing, who actually like looking at that stuff too. For example, I mean, I was bringing up the Patreon artists. The most famous one, the most successful one, Sakimi Chan. She's a female, and she does exactly what guys do. She draws women that are just the breasts are spilling out, and it's like, oh, you can see up my skirt. And I don't know if she's just, I really don't know anything about her, so I'm kind of just looking at the surface here. But maybe she happened to fall on something that makes money and she's just going with it, or she actually truly does enjoy it and doesn't see anything wrong with it. I don't know. But what are your thoughts on that, Jenny? I know I said some dangerous things there.
Note of caution to never call women females.
Wait, what?
Don't call women females. Just call them women.
Oh.
Yeah.
Hey, do I do that?
Marshall, you call women girls.
A lot of the women I know are so young that happens. But should it be women and not girls?
Yeah, it's just women.
Okay,
Wait.
got it.
Okay, hold on. I want to unpack this.
Yeah.
When I'm doing my anatomy lessons, I always say female because someone who was born a female might not identify as a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I'm saying this is what a female body is like, the anatomy of a female body, if I say that this is what a woman's body looks like, that's not true.
I have a point about that, is that there's a distinction between saying female, like, oh, she's a female, versus this is a female figure.
Okay.
It's using female as a noun as opposed to attaching a descriptive adjective to it. It's like a grammatical thing.
Okay, hold on. That's confusing. Sorry, hold on. That's confusing.
Female as an adjective clarifies, but as a noun, woman is preferable. Did I get it right, Jenny?
Mm-hmm. Like when, Stan, you're teaching your anatomy lessons, it's okay to see, it's like completely fine to say female figure. And I think it's really cool that like you're making a distinction between the sex you're assigned at birth versus the gender that you identify with, that you are. But I think saying like these females or like those females or the females, it's the more you say it, the more you hear how it sounds, which is just like bad.
Interesting. Okay. I'll need to talk with you more about that.
We will.
I'm not seeing the
it.
full picture, but yeah. Okay. I will keep that in mind, and I'll do some more research. Is it wrong to also say males then? Does it carry the same weird wrongness? I don't know.
Well, that goes back to like when we sexualize women, is it the same as sexualizing men? And it's like, no, this is a patriarchy. No, it's not the same. It's like when we call women females, we're implying we're seeing them as, it has a different
Other.
connotation.
Yeah.
And males, I don't think people refer to men as males, which is a whole other thing.
Okay, now I want to take a couple of minutes with this, because this is sort of what started this whole conversation, is that the question about sexualization of women brings up the response, well, men are sexualized too.
My response to that is that men and women can both be sexualized in writing, in visual form, right, in paintings, and also in movies especially. But the real life kind of consequences for women who are sexualized versus men who are sexualized aren't the same. We live in a society where oftentimes some men do feel entitled to women's labor, and women get a lot of like unwanted advances, or they aren't as safe or safe in the workplace. So when we're sexualizing men, it's like we romanticize them. Yes, we idealize their masculine bodies in media and pop culture, but these men, it doesn't make it less safe for these men, or they don't get paid less because they're being sexualized. And that's a really important distinction.
Is it only about that, though? Is it only about getting paid the same, or does it have an effect on kids watching it? How a little girl watching sexualized women in a movie has an effect on her. Does a boy watching these superheroes with ripped bodies and tight packages, does that have an effect on them in the same way?
I think when young girls look at images of women sexualized for men, right? Back to what we were talking about the male gaze, it teaches girls at a young age to see their own bodies the way that men see them, or like a male-dominated kind of gaze sees them. So I actually learned this term recently called self-objectification, where you kind of turn the way that society portrays women or media portrays women onto how you view yourself. And so when we're talking about like how women are harmed in media and comics and etc., or how they're sexualized, or how they're defenseless or not fully fledged characters, that affects real women's psyches to different degrees.
Okay, and it doesn't for the boys watching?
I feel like you guys would speak better to that. I have no idea.
Okay.
When I was a kid, Superman and Superboy were very important to me as icons. Superboy in particular, and the fact that he did not compete in sports made an impression on me, because it wouldn't be fair for Superboy to compete in sports. And I thought, that's crazy. That's crazy. If I were Superboy, I would compete in all the sports, and I would have all the admiration of the girls, and everything would be great in my life. And I pondered it for a few years in my childhood, to where I came to the point where I thought, that's right. It isn't fair for Superboy to compete in sports. He should step out of them. So I was getting from a role model of physical strength, how a person with a power like that should act fairly to others. So that's the best I can think about how a masculine role model as a child affected me.
I have a point to that, which is that, like, so little boys grow up seeing people, men like them, boys like them, be super powerful and be the heroes of their own stories. Girls didn't, like, at least for me growing up, I didn't see that nearly as much. I think there's been quite a lot of like studies done on the fact that girls are really, really, really good at STEM until a certain age, usually like after puberty. They aren't as good at it as boys anymore.
At what?
Science, technology, engineering.
Oh,
math.
STEM.
Yeah, STEM.
Right. Yeah. STEM. Got it.
That really, like, it's like how in the classroom, middle school aged, elementary school aged, high school aged girls aren't often as comfortable as raising their voice or participating as boys are. So, like, the stories we tell kind of, they socialize kids of different genders in different ways.
Coming back to my question about Sakimi Chan, is it okay for her to over-sexualize? Like, if a woman's doing it, does it have the same effect?
Yeah, is there license for a woman to treat women however she chooses to?
Is it okay for a woman to portray women through a man's gaze?
I think if a woman's portraying a woman, then it's through that woman's gaze. It can be influenced by the male gaze, but ultimately the authorship, the voices, the woman artist. Because you had also mentioned, like, what if a woman looks at Frazetta's women in his paintings? And I think, like, in that kind of scenario, you're kind of just bringing your own female gaze to it.
Okay.
Your gaze is different from the gaze that was in the composition of the painting, right? That's like a separate layer of gazes. And also, like, that goes into, like, how queer women look at other women's images, which I think I'm just barely, like, delving into in terms of learning about it.
I know a woman who was refused for her graduate work at a university because the people who were reviewing her, one in particular, said that her imagery was all for the male gaze. And she was baffled by it, and she was not accepted for the graduate work. But that was one of the first times, that was 20 some years ago, but that was one of the first times I ever heard the term.
Who was the person in power making that decision? Was it a guy?
No, it was a woman.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
there's something I want to mention is that we had two topics and we bounced all around among them. But one topic was that the content itself is an issue and how people are responding to the content. And then there's the social aspect. There is the way the job world works. There's the way the entry into an industry works. And the two are not in separate compartments because they overlap. That if you get a club that shares a bias, it makes sense that the content that they're going to produce reflects that bias. And when you've got that bias being constantly presented, it could be contributing to what's going on in the social arena with the way the industry works. So we bounced all around that, but the thing that prompted it was the imagery. What do you think of sexualization of women? We have talked about it. I know that we've been kind of a little nervous about it, a little careful about it, but I do feel like we had some good things in this. How do you two feel about it?
I have the quote that I want to bring up.
Okay.
Anthony Francisco was interviewed about his design work, his concept art for Black Panther, and he says, I put a lot of effort in trying to design a very strong woman warrior and making sure she's sexy, but still just fierce and not scantily clad, because that's what we wanted to avoid. And like everyone knows, the costumes turned out incredible.
Yeah. Yay.
And so it's important to have superheroes and superheroines who have costumes that fit the kind of powers and the roles that they have.
Mm-hmm.
And that, like,
right, yeah.
First and foremost, in this case, in Okoye and Nakia's sense, like, they're warriors, they're super strong, and what they're wearing should reflect that because it's about them. It's not about who's looking at them.
Right. They shouldn't just be wearing bikinis while they're going to war.
Yeah. Like a Wonder Woman outfit. Yeah.
Yeah. That is for the male gaze. Bikinis going to war.
Okay. That makes sense. Yeah. The thing I got mostly from this is that we all have the freedom of speech, but what we say affects other people. And so we should be nice to each other. So we should consider what we say affects other people.
I think that it's that we should consider that what we say affects other people, but we should also find out from other people how it affects them and dialogue about this.
Whether it's with words or images, doesn't matter, right? It's all the same. We're communicating something.
Jenny, is there anything that you wish you would have said that you've wanted to say that you haven't?
Yeah, I think something that, like, well, one, everyone's coming from different perspectives and different places, and it's so important, like you said, Marshall, to have conversations like this because we're all practicing empathy and listening with each other and culturally exchanging our experiences and our perspectives and opinions. And I also think that it's super important to acknowledge on this podcast that gives artists and student artists advice that artists of different gender and racial identities face different challenges in their career and their effort to go into the industry and being in the industry. And when those issues aren't talked about, it can feel like the kind of the struggles that they're going through aren't visible, aren't acknowledged. So I'm really grateful that we are bringing these things up in conversation with each other.
Good. It's a beginning.
It's a beginning.
Give us some of your favorite books, graphic novels, the things that you have made an impression on you and that have been good examples for others.
One comics anthology that's really dear to my heart is called Elements. The second book in the series is Elements Earth. It is edited by Tanika Stotts. And it features, I think, 25 creators of color and 20 stories in graphic novel / in comic form. And it's just so exciting that more publications like this are coming out. Some of my other favorite graphic novels are Mooncakes by Suzanne Walker and Wendy Xu. It's about a witch who, it's for me, the book is about getting to see people who are like me, whose stories are just about fantasy and magic, and it's not all about their identities. It's about being who you are and like all of the fun stuff like fantasy that marginalized characters don't always get to be in, those kinds of worlds. A serial comic that's really important that I love is Ironheart, written by Eve Ewing. It is about a Black girl from Chicago who is a STEM genius, and she's at MIT and she designs her own suit, and she goes out and saves lives and is mentored by this AI voice of, I want to say Robert Downey Jr.
Tony
Stark, who is mentored by Tony Stark's AI voice.
Okay.
I'm just going to shoot like 3 more names. So Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me by Mariko Tamaki and Rosemary Valero O'Connell. It is a queer YA romance novel. And it won, I think, an Eisner. And then What We Don't Talk About by Charlotte Christensen and Displacement by Kiku Hughes. And both of these also just came out, I think, pretty recently. They're all really good.
Oh, great. Thank you for sharing these. And thank you for being here, Jenny.
Yeah, of course.
I know this was, there was a lot in preparing for this, getting everything ready, but it was good to have you with us.
Yeah, thank you. I feel educated. Jenny, is there any social handle or website or anything you want to promote where people could find you?
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to connect with people. You can find me on Instagram at jenniferwang.arts. Oh, and I wanted to say that like so much of the work of building allyship and being good allies as people, as human beings, but also as artists, is to self-educate. I know, like, in conversations with Marshall previous to this episode, like, I've recommended a bunch of books to Marshall that he's checked out. And I think that for everyone trying to be a better ally and more supportive and more inclusive, especially in this case of artists in the industry, it's a lot of self-work. It's a lot of educating yourself and doing the work of like Googling what are the good books to read or the good lectures or videos or content that I can see, because so often Black people, people of color are brought on to panels because they have a diverse voice, and people of other marginalized identities as well, but it's not their job to educate everybody else, right? So I'm super grateful for the opportunity to start this conversation with the two of you, but I think that for significant and lasting and meaningful impact, it's really about the amount of effort you put in your own time to keep learning.
Indeed. Yes. Point well taken, Jenny. Thank you. See y'all.